All right. Welcome to episode 91 of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Michael Shermer. He's a science writer, historian of science, founder of the Skeptics Society, and editor-in-chief of its magazine Skeptic, which is largely devoted to investigating pseudoscientific and supernatural claims. He's written many books, the latest of which is called Giving the Devil His Due, Reflections of a Scientific Humanist. And he's the host of the largely popular podcast, The Michael Shermer Show. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, boys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being on.
I forget, where are you?
Oh, wow. So we are in Brooklyn, New York.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. All right. That's right. My daughter lives in Brooklyn, New York. How about that?
Oh,
Small
awesome.
world.
Where?
Yeah. Oh, I don't have the address in my head. I forget where. I know you have different neighborhoods. I just don't remember what they are. But yeah, no, I love Brooklyn, and I did a live show there with Neil deGrasse Tyson a couple of years ago. What's the theater? The King's Theater or something? There's a huge theater there.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that was really fun. Yeah,
wow,
that was really
awesome.
fun.
How long ago was that?
Let's see. That was I think in 2018. Whoopi Goldberg was the kind of guest celebrity star, given that I'm not really a celebrity. And there were a couple other people, comedian. Neil, he likes to have fun with his shows, so it was fun. It was good.
Yeah,
that's very humble.
There was like 3,000 people there. They're mostly there to see Neil, I think.
Yeah, we caught the show that you did with him about your book. That was really great.
Oh, okay. Oh, you saw that. Okay, great. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and on Rogan. I think you're being humble if you're saying you're not a celebrity.
Yeah, you have a really solid track record, especially
I live in Southern California. I live in Santa Barbara, and fame here means you just need one name, Oprah.
Yeah,
the Royals. The Royals are here. Harry and Meghan and little Archie, you see, and Kevin Costner. These are real celebrities. I just walk around and ride my bike around. No one even notices.
I hear you. All right, so to jump into it, I guess I know this is going to be a kind of a rudimentary question, but I still think it's worth kind of exploring. How do people believe, and why do people believe in anything to begin with? Right before we even get into the conspiracy and the pseudoscience.
Oh, right. Well, so, belief begins with just understanding something about the world, learning, just connecting A to B, just causally connected. And, and the brain tries to figure out, is A really causally connected to B, or is it not? So depending on where you want to start, we could start with David Hume, and his definition of causality is constant conjunction. So A happens, then B, A happens, B, A, B, A, B. And at some point, and it doesn't take many trials, the brain makes a connection that, the rat learns when he presses the bar and the pellet comes down that the bar press is associated with the food. So now the bar press becomes like food. It's rewarding. Or, the dog salivates when you ring the bell and you give him some food and he salivates, classical conditioning. So that's A connected to B, and that's called association learning. Now, as Hume pointed out, that may be the case. Every swan you've ever seen is white, so you assume all swans are white. But in fact, with induction, you can't make definitive conclusions because there might be a black swan somewhere. In fact, there are black swans in Australia.
Right.
And or say, and then he used this example from Canterbury Tales of this tale of this rooster who was kind of humanized, who thought that his crowing caused the sun to rise every morning, because every morning he crows and the sun comes up. But of course, Hume's point is constant conjunction doesn't always mean a causal connection. And so his second definition of causality was counterfactual causality. You take A out of the formula, and if B happens anyway, then it wasn't A in the first place that caused it. It was something else. In this case, A was just a proxy for the sunrise. The sunrise is actually causing the rooster to crow, not vice versa. Anyway, so but my point of that is that we're not that good at determining causality based on anecdotal thinking like that, just classical learning, association learning, because oftentimes A has no connection to B at all. You hear a rustle in the grass. Is it a dangerous predator, or is it just the wind? In my thought experiment in the Believing Brain, I pointed out that you can make one of two errors. You can make a type 1 error where you think that the rustle in the grass is the wind, and so you ignore it. Or you make a type 2 error well, sorry, I flipped that, where you assume the rustling grass is just the wind, but it turns out it's a dangerous predator. That's a type 2 error.
Yeah.
That's a much costlier error to make. So it actually pays to assume that A is always connected to B just in case, if it's a dangerous threat in that case. And so we tend to leap to causal connections between things that happen. You know, the parent gets their kid vaccinated, and then the kid is diagnosed with autism a month later or whatever. And they think, oh, well, that was the thing I just did before that. Or you take the homeopathic remedy and your headache goes away. Or you do, take the extract of seaweed and the tumor goes into remission. Right. We just automatically go to that, which is why we need science, because, the tools of science to, actually run a kind of counterfactual. Let's have a control group and a placebo group instead of just the treatment group, because that way we can employ Hume's counterfactual causality. Let's take A out for this group and have no treatment to see what happens. And then with this other group, we give them something and they don't know what it is. That's the placebo group, and so on. And then we just see what happens. And so, of course, that's the randomized controlled trial. But that took centuries for people to figure out that they needed, smart people, philosophers, natural scientists, to figure out we got to do something like that, or else we're not going to really know if what the cause of something is. So belief then builds on that. You start with just making connections and then forming kind of layers on top of that, cognitively. And with language, we put on, linguistic, words and concepts and constructs to build an entire belief system. So something like religion, which is a huge word, just begins with this idea, kind of a supernatural, superstitious connection between what I think is going on in the world and what's causing that. That there's a God behind every event that happens. Nothing happens by chance. A lot of believers think, everything happens for a reason. A lot of believers think. And so the sense is that, somebody's back up there pulling the strings, making things happen. It kind of feels like that. And so the appeal to conspiracy theories is it's the same thing, right? It isn't randomness. It isn't the complex systems that kind of grind along and, there's 20 different variables and who knows what the real cause is. Gas prices go up or down, or revolutions happen, or the economy is tanking, or it's going up, and people can't figure out why. It's easier to just think, well, there's 12 guys in London called the Illuminati, and they're running the world.
Yeah.
So that's all tied up together.
And why do you think that people are so afraid of randomness? So why is it so hard, do you think, that for them to accept that sort of there are these kind of, I guess, this hodgepodge of sort of activities going on in the world, and most of them don't actually have, like, let's say, a clear-cut thread running through them?
Yes, it's not that people are afraid of randomness. We just don't intuitively understand it or grasp it. It's not natural. So lots of examples of this, like when the iPod first came out, they had a random feature on it, a shuffle, so-called iPod shuffle. So, and customers complained to Apple saying, this feature isn't random. These certain songs keep coming up over and over more often than other songs that never seem to come up. Well, that's actual randomness. Clustering of data points like that is randomness. And, the stars in the sky forming constellations. That's actually what randomness looks like. If every star was perfectly distributed with the same amount of distance between them, so you'd have this kind of dot pattern in the sky that was just, boringly homogeneous, there'd be no constellations, but that would not be randomness. Steve Gould once wrote an essay about the glowworms of Australia, in this cave in Australia, whereby by the forces of nature and how they operate for getting food, these worms are hanging from these caves and they glow because it's dark inside. But the worms are all perfectly spaced apart because this is how they gather food. And, it's a maximum competition, minimum competition. So everybody gets the same amount of food, whatever that is. But so Gould's point was that you're in this dark cave and all you see are these points of light like stars in the sky, but they don't form any constellations because they're perfectly spaced. That's not random. That's natural selection. Stars are random. Okay. So my point is that, we're used to thinking of of clusters and patterns as being random, but that's not randomness. Randomness is this other thing that happens. And there's really not much in our evolved psychology to tell us why we would understand that. The law of large numbers, if you have 300 million adult Americans doing stuff every day, and if 0.001% are psychopaths or rapists or killers or genocidal maniacs or rioters or whatever, you're going to have enough to fill the evening news. Yeah. So people feel like there's some kind of pattern. If you have 3 or 4 police shootings or mass school shootings in a month or 2 months, and the country erupts into just this kind of cultural angst about what's going on here. Oh my God, there's a pattern. Well, hang on. Maybe there's a pattern, maybe there's not. School shootings are terrible, but and there's been a little increase over the decades, but nothing that can't be explained by just more guns and more crazy people, more people. So there's the small percentage of crazy people goes up in terms of the raw numbers. So you're going to get by chance more of these. It's like cancer clusters. You always see these stories about, well, there's this community in West Virginia that's kind of near this coal mine, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of prostate cancers or breast cancers or uterine cancers or whatever. And it's like, oh my God, it's the mining company, maybe. But, cluster doesn't mean anything, because you could take a handful of pennies and throw them up and see where they land on the ground. They're not going to be perfectly spaced. They're going to be clusters. Mm-hmm. So again, our intuition tells us a cluster means there's something going on there. There's some causal connection. In fact, randomness tells us probably not.
Do you think that maybe we default to simplistic thinking as sort of a survival instinct? Like, for instance, to my understanding, for us to, in general, accept something as true, we, especially if it's coming from someone, we listen to how certain they are, how many people buy into what they're saying, how congruent they are with what it is that they're saying. And I imagine that if people are hearing, let's say on the news, there's some kind of conspiracy or something like that, when they start to hear that more people are buying into it, that they sort of feel that it's more true.
Yeah, so social proof is what social psychologists and sociologists call this. That is, most of us, most of the time, don't have the time or energy or resources to fact check stories we hear. So we end up trusting our social group. Well, somebody in the group hopefully has checked that. In the case of the news media, we hope ABC, NBC, CBS, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, they all have fact checkers. Right. So what I hear and read, I kind of just hope, I think, that it's been checked, and I don't have to check it myself. And in our evolutionary history, it's really our closest friends and family members. When we're kids, it's the adults, our parents, and we trust them. You have to. No one can. A kid doesn't know how the world works. They just believe whatever their parents tell them. And but that's not a bug. That's a feature. That's normal. And so the problem we're experiencing with the internet is that you just have this tsunami of information just sweeping over our senses. I mean, I could sit here all day just on my limited Twitter feed, chasing down stories, and just hours go by. I mean, sometimes I have to just turn it off and go out for a bike ride for a couple hours just to clear my head, because it's like, what is going on here? This world's gone crazy. Yeah. And then a couple hours away from it, I'm thinking, no, actually things are okay. Because you can, even someone like me who's trained in how not to fall for those things, I fall for them all the time. So the social proof thing. So just take something like QAnon. This has been an interesting phenomenon for me, because this is the craziest, dumbest conspiracy theory I think I've ever heard. And I've heard them all. At least it's in the top 5 of totally crazy conspiracy theories. A satanic cult of pedophiles sacrificing children in a sex slave operation led by Hillary Clinton and Tom Hanks. I mean, you can't, I don't know if you saw my spoof video. Just kind of making fun of this. It's like, it doesn't get any crazier than that. I mean, you couldn't make up something if you tried crazier than that. And yet, like 29% of Republicans and even 13% of Democrats said they think there might be something to it. Now, they can't really believe that. They can't possibly believe that like they would say some scientific empirical claim, climate change or the Big Bang Theory or something. But what they're doing is they're kind of echoing, well, my team, the Republicans say, they seem to think there might be something to it. So, yeah, okay. and it's kind of a kind of a truth that stands in for something else. The analogy I use is like in the OJ trial. Of course, we all watched the whole thing, and there's no way you could possibly believe he didn't kill his wife and her friend.
Yeah.
It was just so obvious. But the defense that the police planted the bloody glove, this actually had a kind of truth to it for the African American community in Los Angeles, because the police used to do stuff like that.
Right.
And they were just racist assholes in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And by the 80s, things were getting better, but there were still some racist cops. And by the time this happened in the 90s, a largely African American jury thought, well, okay, I'm following the arguments and the evidence, but that argument is kind of true for our people in this community. So we're going to quit just to kind of stick it to them in a way. I think that's what was going on.
Yeah.
So in a way, when Republicans say, I believe this crazy conspiracy, or the spinoffs from that and related to it of the rigged election and so on, it was kind of a signal saying, yeah, I know that I'm thinking in their heads, yeah, I know that sounds crazy, but we know that big government is bad and dangerous because that's what our party thinks. And so, and sometimes elections are rigged in particularly third world countries or whatever. And, it's not perfect. No election's perfect. So maybe, and our guy saying that it was rigged, our leader. And so I think they're kind of ticking the box saying, yeah, I think there's something to it in these surveys as a kind of political truth, not empirical truth, but like, this is what our team believes. So I'm going along with that.
Right. And then, I mean, we also know, just kind of like just looking at the situation as it is in terms of, like, let's say a Hillary Clinton. I mean, she said, kind of publicly that I don't, maybe not publicly, let me take that back. She said, I really don't know if I can relate to the majority of the public, because she's like, they're kind of so different from me, or so different from us. So when people kind of say, well, you know what, Hillary is like doing these things that are so against our kind of mores, right? It's actually not that nonsensical, even though obviously once you get into the weeds of it, you're like, okay, this is a bit nonsensical. But just the fact that she, and probably I would say kind of, the quote unquote establishment, is so disassociated from the mainstream public, I'd say there's definitely some truth to that.
Yes, that's right. So how a candidate acts, of course, the confirmation bias, the other team, the other party is going to think the worst, and the worst interpretation of anything they do or say. I mean, again, craziness, the ship stuck in the Suez Canal, there was some crazy conspiracy that Hillary was behind it because the name of it, the Ever Given, was similar to Evergreen, which had some connection to the Whitewater scandal in the 80s. And then that came up in the 90s when Clinton ran for president. And it's one of these things, like 20 steps later, you're at, Hillary caused the ship to. Yeah. So I call that patternicity, tendency to find meaningful patterns in random noise. And,
Right.
Again, like the face of Jesus on the tortilla, or Virgin Mary on the side of the building. It's something like that.
Right.
Just connecting the dots to something that represents what we think. We think Hillary's a bad person.
Right.
She's a Democrat. We're Republicans. They're the bad people, and it's gotten worse in the last 20 years or so with the polarization of politics, in which there, of course, the political parties were always divided ideologically, but they disagreed with each other on policy more on an intellectual level rather than a moral level. So in other words, the conservatives are wrong about their tax rate proposals, or vice versa. But now it's not just that they're wrong, but that they're evil.
Right.
They're trying to destroy the country.
Yeah.
And that's really makes it much worse.
It's strange to me that we have sites like PolitiFact, for instance, right, where we can definitely fact check what politicians say, right? But yeah, when they take up, let's say, these moral arguments, it kind of makes things murky, right? You stop paying attention to the facts.
Right. When it's like, you have good guys versus bad guys, and then it's like, oh, well, they're painting us as the evildoers, right? When they're the evildoers. Right.
Yeah. Apparently congressmen and senators just, they don't spend much time together anymore, like they used to in the old days. They'd fight and argue and yell at each other in Congress, and then they'd go to lunch together or have a drink after work or whatever, and their kids played together. But now apparently that doesn't happen anymore, and a lot of them just go home on the weekends to raise money, because it's so expensive now to run for office, and I guess there's just much less interaction. And then also the rise of talk radio, which is mostly conservative, And talk television, again, Fox News versus, I don't know, MSNBC, maybe CNN and that on the other side. And so they listen to that. I mean, a lot of times I'll surf around and listen to the different talk shows, and then I'll hear a congressman or senator give a speech the next day. It's like, Tucker Carlson was just saying that last night. I bet this guy watched that show. And sure enough, he's on the show the next day. I'm like,
Right.
oh, okay. So these guys listen to these talk radio hosts and then they echo it.
Yeah.
And it's very destructive because the things that these people talk about on talk radio, it's terrible. I mean, just, Hillary or Obama or Biden, they want to destroy America.
Right.
It's just incredible that anybody could actually believe that.
Wait, and then so Michael,
Go ahead.
all right. So if we're saying that, right, I think all three of us can agree that a lot of these claims are insanely absurd, right? I think like this is a consensus amongst all of us, right?
Sure.
So why is then the argument to give the devil his due, right? Why should we give any of these people platforms?
Oh, well, okay, there's two issues there. First, the First Amendment issue.
Right.
These are largely not First Amendment issues. Of course, the government's not coming in to say you can't, Fox News can't exist, or the Wall Street Journal can't publish its op-eds. No one's saying that.
Right.
And on the but culturally, socially, I would say yes, I would defend their right to have that. I would not censor them in any way. I'm against cancel culture. I always think we should combat these bad ideas with just better ideas, and just say, well, you're wrong, and here's why. Or, you've got, it's always problematic to say you're wrong because people take that personally. Maybe you're incorrect in your interpretation of those facts. Let's talk about those, something like that.
Right.
If you tell people they got to give up their cherished beliefs, they're not likely to do that.
Right.
So, yeah. So giving the devil his due, yes, the core argument there is the devil is whoever disagrees with you, and they should be given their due because you want them for you to be able to give your due. You want them to protect your rights to speak. And the moment you engage in cancel culture, then you're kind of shifting the norms toward those coming back to bite you when you're the one who is challenging whatever the status quo is. So, that's one argument. Second argument is you might be partially wrong or completely wrong. Listening to other people, you can correct your mistaken beliefs. But even more important, because most of us don't think we're wrong, because if we did, we would change our beliefs, but we don't because we think we're right. Anyway, so if nothing else, you can improve the quality and power of your own arguments by knowing what the other side thinks. And so my example I always give of this is my students at Chapman are pretty liberal.
Mhm.
And so I know they're pro-choice on the abortion issue, but I know that there are some who are pro-life, and they are so afraid to say anything in class. Yeah, I have to kind of drag it out of them because they're kind of looking back and forth like, ooh, is it okay if I say this? And I remind them, half the country, are pro-life, half.
Right.
That's it's like 100 million people agree with you, so it's okay to say anything. Yeah, but the people in this room. Okay, so to the pro-choicers, I say, give me what you think are the best arguments that the pro-lifers have.
Yeah.
And they don't really know what they are. Oh, they hate women. No, that's not an argument that they would think. Maybe they do. I don't know, but that isn't the point. The point is, what are they actually arguing? So I'll use some example like Ben Shapiro because he's pretty popular with the kids.
Mhm.
And here are the things he argues. And okay, now I still think Ben is wrong. I disagree with him on that. But my pro-choice position is stronger by knowing the pro-life arguments. Okay, so that's the the case for free speech. This is all laid out in John Stuart Mill's book on liberty in 1859, and it still holds true today. And again, my concern, one reason I wrote the book was because it was my team, the liberals, who were always defending free speech. The free speech movement in Berkeley, and all through the 90s and early 2000s, it was defending free speech. And then since 2010 or so, there's been this cultural shift. It's kind of upside down of now liberals saying, "Oh, hate speech, the words are violence, and we have to combat this form of violence with censorship and so on." It's like, wait a minute, no. We spent the last 50 years saying that was the wrong approach. And I'm always reminding people of, it was conservatives that used to be fanatically opposed to like burning the American flag and rock songs,
Right.
and and all the kind of protests and signs that protesters would hold up, and that's all speech. And the Supreme Court held up all of those cases. You can burn the American flag. You can sing about Satan all you want in your rock songs. There's nothing the government can do about it. And I always tell people to go to YouTube and watch this video clip of Frank Zappa, this old 60s rocker, 70s rocker. By the 80s, he was older and more conservative or more liberal or more active, defending free speech. And there's this great clip where I think it was Firing Line, where he and this senator, this old white guy, complaining about kids these days. Have you heard the rock songs? And Zappa just schools him. He's like, they're just words, Senator. They're just words. You need to get out more. It's just great. And so I reminded people of that, because here the conservative is going, oh no, we got to censor people. And now it's, you go on, listen to conservative talk radio and television and Fox News. They're all going free speech, free speech. It's like, wait a minute. We can't let these guys be the defenders of free speech against us being censorious. That's not right.
Yeah, and one of the coolest kind of things that ever happened to me as a college student. So my college mentor, Dr. Timothy Stroop, he was a philosopher in John Jay College, and just one of my favorite human beings in the entire world. So what he used to actually do is at the end of the course, so he taught ethics and law in John Jay. He would have like these big debates between every single person in the class. So he would have one side versus the other side. And the catch to it was that you had to actually choose the opposing view. So if, let's say, you were for affirmative action, you had to debate against affirmative action. If you were against affirmative action, you had to debate for it. And it was so wild, because what happens towards the end is eventually people are like, you know what? I still disagree with the other view, but I could kind of see like why you believe that.
It's kind of like steel manning, right?
Yeah. And I do. So, Michael, do you think that we have like enough of that in college, where you kind of have these type of debates where people are sort of trying to? No, right? Yeah,
I love that. That's such a great example. We should package that.
Yeah.
No, that's really good. Yeah, that is a good tool. That's a classic tool of steel manning. Yeah, just can you articulate what the other side is arguing?
Yeah,
and usually people can't do it. It is hard to do. I have a hard time doing it, and I do it for a living. But again, and then the other side of that, though, is I think sometimes when I do that, I'll steel man some person's position, and I can see them when they hear what it sounds like, they'll think, I can do better than that. No, that's not what I mean. Here's what I mean. And they say it rather differently. And I can see that it's working on them too. Like, okay, I got to improve my arguments, because if that's what he thinks I'm saying, then it doesn't sound so good. Right. So, conversation is just this kind of back and forth, constantly kind of refining what exactly we mean about whatever it is we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think even making the attempt to steel man at least builds rapport between you and whoever you're conversing with. Right. Because usually they just feel like you're this other, you don't understand my position. They'll strengthen their own position. You'll strengthen yours. But by attempting to at least show that you're trying to understand them, then sometimes they kind of let their guard down. Maybe they'll listen to you more. I suppose it depends who you're conversing with as well. But it is an interesting tool. Yeah.
And by the way, that's actually what my mentor did with me. So I hate to admit this, but I mean, I've said this on the show before, so it is what it is. I'm actually a reformed conspiracy theorist, and I was into all of that stuff, from the reptilians to freaking, who else was there? Bill Cooper, you name it, the whole freaking shebang. So when I took Tim's class, so he was really cool. And so when I took Tim's class, he's like who are you supporting this year? Who's your candidate? I was like, oh, Ron Paul. Ron Paul's fucking winning the whole thing. And he's like, wow, you really believe that? And I said, yeah. I was like, Ron Paul, man. I was like, you're not looking at the real polls, right? I was like, one of those people. There are these real polls, right? That, the mainstream media isn't showing. So like what Tim did with me was that he would little by little, he would give me like literature, and he would say, okay, you know what? If you really understand these topics, why don't you refute them? Why don't you come to class? You read the material, and if you know so well about what the other side thinks, and you really think they're right, why don't you refute these topics? And so what he did with me was that he put me in a position where I became sort of curious about what the other side was, rather than hearing what the other side was thinking from my side, right? Rather than hearing like Ron Paul's perception of the Federal Reserve, which is obviously super skewed. And then so Tim was like, why don't you read Paul Krugman? Why are you reading only Ron Paul? Why don't you kind of look at the other side, right? And so what I love about that, and a question I pose to the both of you is, do you guys think that maybe it would be more helpful if we utilize more Socratic questioning to kind of help people understand why it is they believe what they do, instead of, obviously, kind of being aggressive and saying, no, this is why I'm right. So using more Socratic questions to actually get them to understand why they believe what they believe.
Yeah, that's a great example. Tell us the name. What was the name of your professor again? Tim?
Oh, Dr. Tim Stroop.
Stroop.
Stroop, yeah, Stroup.
I wonder if there's anything online of his, if any of his courses were recorded, or it'd be interesting to see him at work.
Oh, so that's such a good question, man. So Tim actually just passed away in the past couple of months. So unfortunately, no, there was nothing recorded, but Tim was a teacher in John Jay for, oh my God, over 30, 40 years. He has a whole long lineage. And by the way, he was actually mentored by John Mackey, which is like the coolest fucking thing ever if you're like into philosophy. So because he went to Oxford. And so, but no, unfortunately, none of his courses were recorded. But the thing is,
because we should package that. I mean, other people do it, and that is the proper way. That is the proper job of a professor. I'm a professor, and more we're seeing, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, professors acting as activists rather than as Socratic teachers, which is exactly what they should be. I mean, I have tons of opinions, but I try to make sure my students really actually don't know what they are. Or if I say that they are, I'll go, this is just my opinion. But, I don't care what you think on this. It doesn't matter what I think. We're here to learn. And, they all have to write a paper, and they all have to give a student TED talk, and they have to defend a position. And I tell them 20 times, I don't care what the position is. That's not what I'm interested in. I want to see you defend it, and do you know what the counter arguments are, and what are your counter arguments to the counter arguments, and so on. That's the only thing that matters. And the reason I say that so many times is because so many professors now are just activists. They're there to teach the students what the correct answers are to these complex social issues. And that's just no good, because it's just not like that in social issues. They're usually so complex that we don't know what the correct answer is, or they're conflicting rights, say the rights of the fetus versus the rights of the mother in the abortion debate. There's no perfect resolution to that. There's no like scientific experiment we're going to run or data we're going to collect, and that's the correct answer, and everybody else is wrong. It's not like that for a lot of these political moral issues, or constant conflicts. And what's the right tax rate? I don't know. This country has this rate, and this state has that rate, and Texas has no income tax. Here in California, 10%. I paid 10% more income tax above my federal. I know this because I just did my taxes this week, and it was painful. And so, I'm paying 33% to the Fed and 10% to the state. Maybe I should do what Joe Rogan did and move to Texas. Then I have no income tax.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So, but it's not like Texas is right and California is wrong. It's just, different states run different experiments, and you can pick and choose, or run for office, or vote this other guy in that's going to pass your legislation that you want. Yeah. So there you absolutely have to have multiple voices in case of in a classroom, because how are they going to know that there's actually, 4 different positions on that particular issue, and you're just giving them one of them?
Out of curiosity, how would you, I don't know if reconcile is the right word, but okay, so I definitely agree with you, and I think a lot of people will agree with you that to combat bad ideas with better ideas is the right way to go, right? What would you say
or you can just ignore them. I mean, you don't have to address everybody. You could just, it's like you don't have to invite Milo Yiannopoulos to your campus to speak. You can just ignore him. That's also an option.
So out of curiosity, say somebody is objectively correct. Their argument is on point. They steel man the other person's argument perfectly, and their argument is just better, objectively speaking. But when a factor like, let's say, charisma or popularity sort of comes into play, how do we sort of deal with that? Because that could just make dangerous ideas that aren't objectively true more popular and rampant.
That's a really good question.
Well, make your side sexier.
That's what
Yeah.
it is, right? Yeah.
I mean, you just the way it
Trump
is.
up.
I mean, it's like
You got to
we
trump
know
yourself
we
up.
know that's right. Trump yourself up. I mean, Trump was a great campaigner. He's really
was.
funny. He's really entertaining compared to pretty much any of the other candidates of the 15 back in 2015 when he first started running. I remember listening to Megyn Kelly's show when she first started her podcast, and she was recounting working in the newsroom at Fox News when Trump announced. And I guess Roger Ailes came in and said, all right, I want a camera crew on Trump 24/7.
Mhm.
And they're like, well, but don't we have an obligation to cover the other 14 candidates in the primaries? He's going, fuck those guys. They're boring. I
Yeah.
want a camera crew on Trump. This is our ratings goldmine. We're gonna make a boatload of money on this guy. And they did.
Mhm.
Right. And he was, Scott Walker and Ted Cruz. He's trying to up his game now because he saw what Trump did with that, but he's too stiff. He's not funny like Trump. So yeah, I don't want to say channel your inner Trump, but because this is too much baggage that goes with that. But you know what I mean? That we know from tons of studies that better looking people, really good looking people, they get so many breaks in life, women and men. Taller, good looking men are more likely to win elections and so forth. Well, you just gotta up your game, improve the quality of your voice. If you're a public speaker, I took a training course on this once when I first started public speaking. I had no idea. People go, oh, you got to speak from down here in your lungs, not up here where you're kind of nasal. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I had no idea, and then it's just dress, put on a nice jacket and, and I don't know, stand tall with your shoulders back. There's just all kinds of things you could do.
Yeah.
And those things make a difference. Now, in a perfect world, maybe we would say they would make a difference, but that's not the world we live in. And so.
Where did you learn to public speak?
Oh, mostly just by doing it. But I think this was like in the late 80s. Somebody had said, you should call this person here. They're a voice coach and they teach people how to speak. Okay. So I took some lessons and then I also started actually just watching professional speakers. Initially just like self-help people like Tony Robbins and people like that. It's like, wow, they're really good. Yeah. And so watching other people. Now, some of it's personality and temperament. Like I can't do what Neil deGrasse Tyson does. He's so animated. Or say someone like Bill Nye. He's funny. Bill is really funny. And I know Bill personally, and I've spent a lot of time with him alone at small dinners, and he's funny off the air, off camera. He's witty, he's fast, he's quick, he's entertaining. And some of that just comes naturally, but a lot of it comes with practice. You just do it and do it and do it and do it. And, so that's why I have my students do a student TED Talk. They got to get up there in front of class, 18 minutes, just like a TED. And I give them the whole outline that TED gave me. Here's the things you got to do, and here's what your PowerPoint should look like. And because there's a skill to it. Yeah. But ultimately, you just have to do it enough and that you get better at it, like anything else. And so that also makes a difference for delivering your ideas, your allegedly correct ideas over the bad ideas. The delivery also makes a difference, which is true in writing too. I mean, take someone like Steve Pinkers. Did you have his book there? Richard Dawkins, Steve Gould, Carl Sagan. These are great writers, and that makes a difference, and it should make a difference. That's a skill, and it's like, people, I know some scientists or academics kind of jealous of Richard, when particularly with the God delusion, when it just went bonkers and sold, millions of copies. And they were kind of griping, how come my book doesn't, well, because you're not as good a writer as he is, to be blunt. Right. I had to tell a few people, he's a great writer. That's a skill, so go learn the skill. Delivering the content is just as important as the content.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you say that, because for me, my favorite speaker of all time is Bobby Kennedy. And for anybody who's ever seen Bobby Kennedy's early speeches, they were horrible. So back when he was still living like in JFK's shadow, they were awful. He stuttered, he muttered, he couldn't get his words out. And people were like, damn, man, maybe like politics just isn't for you. And then like little by little, especially after Jack passed away, I mean, like Bobby became a really phenomenal and kind of fervent speaker. And and the thing is with him, it wasn't even that he had this like sort of arousing voice. It was just that he was able to clearly convey his ideas in an emotional way where people kind of got the sense that he cared. Whereas like, I think with Trump, what you're seeing is that he's just like, he believes in himself, right? So you see a confidence there, which is cool. But like when you kind of, let's say, contrast that with the Barack Obama, you actually got the sense that that person, that human being, actually cared about you when he was talking. So
yeah, when Barack speaks, you get the sense he's thinking about it. Like he pauses, like I'm thinking about my next sentence or whatever. So that gives you a sense like he's not just reading the teleprompter, you know, he's actually thinking. Jordan does that too. Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
This is, what's the explanation for the Jordan Peterson phenomenon? Well, he's really good at what he does. He's a good speaker, and I've been on stage with him several times, and I've seen him perform, if you want to call it that. It is kind of a performance, not a lecture.
Yeah.
And he doesn't give a lecture. He just comes out. I think the first time I saw him was he was on some panel discussion. There was like 3 speakers at a conference, and the first 2 were just academics, like, they just delivered, they hold up the, their notes like, and this kind of thing. Yeah. And then Jordan comes out. He was the 3rd speaker. I forget the topic, but they were kind of just quoting philosophers and ideas, and he just walks out. He goes, after I got invited to this, I've just been thinking about this. And, yesterday I was reading Nietzsche, and, Nietzsche has this idea. And then, next thing he's talking about Jung and the theme of the conference. And it's like, boy, it just changed the whole atmosphere of the room. It's like, oh my God, this guy is like totally engaged. And everybody's like, what's he going to say next?
Right.
Instead of delivering a boring speech, you're kind of doing a performance with the audience, and they're, giving you energy back. And, that's an art. There's an art to that.
Absolutely.
Why do you think he still gets flack? I think it's been already, the nuance has been revealed that he just, that the whole thing with I believe he didn't want to, pardon me, if you could correct me, the transgender thing, right?
He didn't want to call people by their pronouns.
Yeah, he didn't want to call people by the pronouns, but not because he didn't respect them, because he didn't want it to be legislated. He didn't want it to be considered a hate crime if he or someone else spoke out of turn, right? Yeah. However, I believe it's been elucidated on several different interviews that he said that if someone asked him to call them by their pronoun, he would definitely respectfully call them by that. And that's been cleared up already a million times. And I'll still talk to some of my other friends, and I'll tell them I love Peterson. I love some of his lectures, those conversations at seminars where he spoke with either Sam Harris or losing my thread here. It's fine. But yeah,
I think he even did one with Slavoj Žižek.
Yeah, there you go. There
Joe Rogan, he was on Joe. I just had him on. We did 3 hours last week. That we'll post this on my podcast.
Oh, nice.
Spectacular. We got into all that. Well, okay. So my take on it is, first of all, he's pushing some hot button issues that are current right now, which is good. That's what you're supposed to do as a public intellectual. And yes, he did make that clear about calling people by whatever they want to be called, of course, because he's not an asshole. Yeah. And that's what you do. You're polite. The example I use is I had a roommate at Pepperdine whose name was Dwayne, and he hated his name. I had actually gone to high school with him. And so he just came to us one day and said, I've changed my name. We're like, oh, okay. D'Artagnan. And we're like, what? D'Artagnan. The 3 Musketeers, the 4 Musketeers, D'Artagnan. We're like, how do you spell that? You're like, well, let's see. D'_ARTGAN. It's like, so then he said, okay, just call me Dar. I'm like, okay. So we did. And I still in touch with him. I call him Dar. Okay. And of course you do that because, we're not assholes. He's our friend. Okay. All right. That's his name. Right. Of course, what Jordan is worried about. And so we actually got into this in our conversation because we got talking about fascism and the Nazis and to what extent, this is a project I've been working on for a long time, is to what extent were the German people Nazified? That is to say, in the larger question, how do you get one of the most cultured, educated nation of people in modern history to become goose-stepping Nazis? How do you do that? And one answer is that they never actually did do that in terms of the majority. Hitler came to power on a minority. party, and there were other parties, so no one had a majority. And then once he got some power, he got more power, and then made himself dictator, eliminated the press, and then started locking people up who were dissenting in any way.
Right.
So you have two effects going on there: pluralistic ignorance, where everybody thinks everybody else thinks something is true, when in fact almost nobody believes it. Like college drinking is the classic study done on this, binge drinking. If you ask individual college students, do you like to binge drink? They almost all go, no, I don't like it. No, I get sick. It's terrible. But I know everybody else is into it, so I got to do it. So one counter to this the colleges are using now is to cite the study going, hey, look, everybody, no one actually likes this, so stop doing that.
Right.
Okay. So in a way that kind of happened because there was no opportunity for dissent to be voiced. Again, back to free speech. If I think everybody else believes this thing, then I think, well, I guess, back to the social proof, I guess I'll just go along, or maybe they're right. What do I know? Everybody else is doing this. But if somebody then stands up and says, I'm not too sure about it, then somebody else goes, hey, me too. I was thinking the same thing. I don't think it's good. And then all of a sudden you got a room full of people going, you know what, this is all bullshit. Let's stop believing it. And then of course I'm going to go, I knew it. Okay. I can trust my own thoughts. But, in case of Hitler, if you lock everybody up that dissents, well, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. Right. And so that's what happened. That kind of held the whole thing aloft for 12 years. Well, so Peterson told me that one reason for that standing up to Bill C-16 in Canada was, had people back in 1932, or when Hitler was running in, say, 31, when he was coming into power, that they stood up and said something then, and when there was time to do it, before they suppressed the press and started locking people up, maybe they could have stopped him then. Right. So this is why he drew the line. Again, it's not what you and I call somebody we know. That's not it at all. It's to what extent the state is going to come in and go, you are going to do this or else, fine or jail, imprisonment, and so on. And that is, of course, what's behind the law. As Max Weber famously defined the government as the institution with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. They're the one organization that can say, we have guns and we have jails. And if you don't do it, you don't follow the law, we're going to penalize you. And then we're going to do this and this and this. Eventually, we're going to send somebody to your house with guns and we're taking you to jail. Now, there's a lot of steps between, the one and the other, to be sure. But, just try not paying your taxes. Okay, well, you could probably get away with it for a few years, and you'll get letters, and then you'll get, bills for fines. And then they'll put a lien on your house, and there's many steps in between. But at some point, there's going to be a warrant out for your arrest for not, whatever it is your law you broke, and then you don't show, not a warrant for your arrest, a court case, let's say, and you don't show up. Well, then boom, you're guilty. All right. So now you got to show up in court for your penalty trial. Well, I'm not going to go. Well, at some point, they're coming to your house with guns. Okay, this has to be in a state. The state has to have that kind of power, or else people are just going to go, I'm not going to follow the laws, right? So at least that's our kind of the social contract, how it works. So Jordan's point is that you got to stop it early when you can, right? That was his point. Now back to your first part of that question. I think some of it is jealousy, honestly, because I've known a lot of famous intellectuals in my life now, Carl Sagan, Stephen Jay Gould, to name a few, in the, say, 80s. And they were vilified. Oh my God, people just, now we didn't have social media, so it wasn't quite as prominent.
Wait, people hated Carl Sagan?
Oh, his colleagues, fellow astronomers.
Wow,
and scientists.
he's like the nicest guy.
Yeah. No, a lot of jealousy there. Just, how come this guy's on the Tonight Show? Why am I not on the Tonight Show? There's a lot of that. I mean, I understand. I get that. A bunch of people have put all this work in, and they run these experiments. They collect all this data from the Hubble Space Telescope or whatever, and they publish these technical papers. They spend decades on some theory, and then Carl Sagan goes on the Tonight Show to talk about it. And it's like, how come I'm not on the Tonight Show to talk about that? How come I don't have a book that sells 1 million copies? How come I don't have my own PBS television series? Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's just the way it goes, because most people can't do that.
Right.
And that's a gift. And, Jordan has a gift of communication. in his own powerful way. He's not entertaining and funny like say Neil deGrasse Tyson is. He's pretty serious. It's hard to get him to crack a smile. He'll do it, but it's a different kind of and people kind of snap to attention, like, oh my God, this guy's saying something serious. I'm going to listen. And so there's that, and also he's not towing the tip, just kind of right down the progressive left line. I don't think he's really conservative in any kind of the traditional way people think of conservatives, but let's just say he's kind of centrist. But to the modern left, far left, centrist is, you're a Nazi. It's basically anybody, 1 millimeter to the right of center is, is Hitler in the new way of configuring these things. And so, of course, anybody like that, and Jordan says anything, like on the trans issue, not just the pronouns, but like I just had Abigail Schreier on my podcast with her book, Irreversible Damage, about trans kids, mostly girls, transitioning to boys in their early teen years, taking puberty blockers and testosterone, and even worse, the top surgery, as it's called. I never heard this till I read this book. They get their boobs lopped off, double mastectomy. I mean, women that have to get double mastectomies because of breast cancer, it's a massively traumatic experience psychologically, not to mention physically. And here these, teenage girls are voluntarily doing it. Why? This is the question. So it's her hypothesis, Abigail's, is that they're not really trans. They don't want to be boys. They want to be part of the cool culture trend that's going on right now, which is trans. Mm-hmm. Okay. So now she's gotten a shitload of hate. And then I got some of it for just talking to her. Mm-hmm. So, and I don't have a dog in that fight. I don't, it's not my thing, but, because I get other people.
I would just wonder what the data is, because from what I've seen is essentially the majority of trans kids, even after transitioning, don't want to transition back. So, I mean, just to kind of argue that it's sort of like the cool thing to do, I know it's a bit reductionist.
Well, okay. So back to your first question there, what's the real number? So I asked her this, because she said the real number is like 0.01%. So 1/10 of 1% trans. Now maybe it's higher than that. Maybe it's 1%. I don't know. I guess that's probably debatable. But in some of these communities, she says, it's like 10%, 20%. Well, it can't be that high. But maybe it is. Maybe we've been oppressing people for so long that they've been afraid to come out, and maybe this is the new real norm. Okay. So her counter to that, so I'm steel manning the arguments because I read the critiques of her book. Mm-hmm. And so she said, well, but it's not happening in other cohorts. First of all, it used to be that whatever the low number is, 0.01%, maybe 1%. It was the same between boys transitioning to girls and girls transitioning to boys. Now it's all just the one, just girls transitioning to boys. And only in that cohort, like 13 to 17, not 18 to 24, not 25 to 30, not 30 to 30. None of the other cohorts have had any shift in transitioning, in the sense that if it was now culturally acceptable, shouldn't it be happening across age cohorts? I'm just giving you her response to this. Yeah, kind of that counterfactual causality. That would be one way to test that hypothesis. And anyway, so again, I don't have a dog in that fight, but my sense is that it's some combination of cultural acceptance, so more people are doing it. But I'm troubled by the idea that a 13-year-old has any idea what gender means for them at that age, and then to make a decision that could affect your life for the rest of your life, the next 30, 40 years, 50 years. We don't let them drive. They can't vote. They can't join the military and go to war. They can't drink or smoke or take drugs. And there's a reason for that. The 2005 Supreme Court decision, the justices said you can't execute a minor because whatever they did, however bad it was, they don't have the kind of self-control. The prefrontal cortex is not fully developed and so forth to be held completely morally accountable for their actions. Therefore, they should be treated differently than adults. Right. Well, if that's true for all these other things, shouldn't that be true for a 13-year-old and gender? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's fair. When I first heard about these issues, I started reading, the literature about gender and sex and how they're different. And all. It's like, wow, this is way more complicated than I thought.
It is, yeah.
And I had to read a lot to kind of wrap my mind around it. I thought, how would a 13-year-old have any idea what the hell all this means? Their body's going through all these changes and they're like, oh, I feel differently. Yeah. Okay. We all kind of went through the, anyway.
All right. Well, yeah. And I mean, going back to the trans argument, the idea there is that obviously if they hit puberty at that point, right, it's sort of traumatizing for them. So whatever degree is obviously different for different kids and different people. I don't know. So in that respect, I haven't really been able to square the two. So those two ideas, obviously, on the one hand, where you have kids having surgery or not having surgery, and then on the other hand, you obviously don't want people who are legitimately trans kids, kind of going through the puberty of a male if they're essentially a female, and then vice versa. So I don't know. I wish I had the answer to that, but you're right. It is a complex topic. And when you kind of go into the details of it, it's far from black and white, very far.
Yeah. Anyway, so back to the larger point, that we need to have conversations about that and research and publish research. I mean, there's examples where scientists have had their articles retracted by scientific peer-reviewed journals when social media puts pressure on them because they say it's transphobic to publish that data. Data cannot be transphobic. It is whatever it is. If you think the data is wrong, then publish another article showing why that's wrong. You collected for the sample size was biased, or what the sample you chose was biased, whatever. After I had her on, I had people writing me, why don't you talk to this person? Or why don't you cite these studies? It's like, send me the studies. Crickets. Who should I have on? Crickets. It's like, all right, well, sorry.
Yeah, even if the data hurts, so to speak, right? We should be paying attention to it. I'm sorry, facts are facts, right? Yeah.
And so speaking of that, speaking of kind of scientific information, right? So if we're not appealing to the legal system, right? A la, the Jordan Peterson argument or conversation we just had. So if we're not appealing to the legal system to kind of enforce, sort of rules on what we can and can't say, and then obviously we're saying, we're giving the devil his due, right? So what happens then when misinformation, and in particular scientific misinformation, is propagated? How do we combat that? Is it like with some disclaimer or asterisk, kind of like what Twitter and Facebook are doing?
Yeah. Let me address that in a second, but first make another point. We need to separate moral issues about rights and how people are treated from scientific questions about the stuff we were just talking about. It doesn't matter if it's 0.001% that's trans, or if it's just one person in the country who's trans. They have the same rights as citizens and should be protected under the Constitution and so on.
Right.
Now, where this comes into conflict culturally is, say, the women's sports issue now that's on the front burner. So you have a trans male to female, and they want to enter women's sports, say in high school, track and field. You've seen these videos where these guys that are now trans women, they just kick the ass of these other women. I mean, it's just not even close. Yeah. And, so yes, we want to protect the rights of trans, but what about the rights of the women to compete against other women? There's a reason there's women's divisions, and the Title IX thing, this is fought for decades, that women's sports should be equal, and on and on. And so here again, much of the conflicts we deal with are conflicting rights, like the rights of the fetus, the rights of the mother. Here, the rights of the trans versus the rights of girls in sports, say. There's no perfect answer to that. To me, I side on the side of women that have fought hard for these rights, and not to give them up. And again, it makes me nervous when it's always the guys want to enter the women's division. It's never women want to enter the guys' division. Why is that? Well, it's pretty obvious why. And also historically, men have always tried to control women and lord it over them and capture their reproductive rights and so on. There's a long history of this. And so whenever men want to get in on women, bathrooms, prisons, sports, I automatically go, wait a minute, guys, that's what men have been doing for centuries, or not millennia. So we got to push back against that. Anyway, so what? They're combating. What was the question again?
Yeah, so if we're not using the legal system, right, to combat scientific misinformation, then how are we doing it? Yeah.
Yeah. We're doing well. We're doing it like what we're doing now, podcasts, or write op-ed pieces for your local newspaper, for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or, go on TV, or, write books, give speeches, and just go down to the local park with your bullhorn and go, hey,
Yeah. But
whatever it is. I mean,
but what happens though? Because like, I mean, we obviously we all agree that it's kind of the society in general is just so polarized, right? Like I can name you, God knows at this point, because our family is Russian, our families are Russian. So we have a ton of anti-vaxxers in our family. We have a ton of election fraud folks in our families, right? I mean, this is kind of like a thing, especially in Brooklyn, right? So yeah. So it's especially like in Brooklyn, we have like these clusters of like Italian and Russian communities who are super conservative, right? So what do we do there then? Especially if like, it's misinformation being spread and they're only, because it's so polarized, they're only looking at each other's like Facebook feeds.
Yeah.
I think it goes back to your point earlier of combating bad ideas with better ideas, right? It's just that if it's about the presentation. Yeah, sorry.
You have to do it. Yeah, it's about the presentation. That's right. You have to do it in a way that doesn't make them feel they have to give up their, deepest conviction. So if someone is defining themselves as conservative, we know what that means. They have kind of a suite of things that they believe: small government, lower taxes, and individual freedom and individual rights, blah, blah, blah. And so if you go, well, you have to give all that up to accept this idea I'm giving you, they're not going to give that up. The example I give, you give people a choice between Darwin and Jesus, creationists. They're not picking Darwin. Okay. Right. He's not going to save your soul. Okay. Right. So you have to say, look, you can keep Jesus and your soul and heaven, the whole package. Maybe evolution is the way God created life. You have to present it in a way that they don't have to give anything up. Just accept the truth because it's true. Right. Accept the science because it's true, and without having to give anything up. So to your conservative friends, you just have to say, look, I understand where you're coming from. Conservatives are great. It's all good. But on this one thing here, this is what we think is going on. Something like that. Also, it helps if you can find an ally on their side who accepts your position. So, for example, to Christians, I don't send them to Richard Dawkins to read about evolution. I send them to Francis Collins, because Francis Collins, his science bona fides are great. He's the head of the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, that is. And he has a couple of best-selling books defending evolution, explaining how evolution works all the way down to the genetic level. And no one writes as good as Richard Dawkins, but he's a good writer. Francis Collins is a good writer, and he explains how we know evolution happened. And he's on their team. He's a born-again evangelical Christian who accepted Jesus as his savior. John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son that you may have eternal life, blah, blah, blah. He buys the whole thing, and he accepts evolution. So I give him that book and go, here, this is your guy. He's on your team, and he says evolution's okay to believe in. They go, oh, okay. So again, that's an example.
How often does that work?
I don't know, because I don't have a database. It's just something I do. I can just tell from feedback, like they drop the wall and they go, okay, they're listening to me now. And I think that's the key to that kind of open communication.
Yeah, it makes sense. We had Kirk Schneider on. He wrote a book called Depolarizing America, and he sort of outlines this method for how to sort of have these really quote unquote uncomfortable conversations. And actually, a lot of what we're discussing here is actually part of that method. One steel manning what they're saying, seeing where they're coming from. They start to let their guard down, as you say, and then you start to be able to go have a back and forth and then understand each other and integrate both sides.
Yeah.
Or if there's more than both,
Absolutely. And Michael, was that kind of like go ahead.
Yeah, if you can find some common ground where you might say, look, I agree with you on this and this, just this one little thing here, that makes them feel like, we have something to share and be respectful, and also if you can find a way to say, I can see why you believe that, or better, I used to believe that, or I believe some of this, because I'm socially liberal, but I'm kind of classically liberal economically. So libertarian, classical liberal, whatever you want to call me. Mm-hmm. So here I can say, I'm totally, to my conservative friends, I totally get why you're concerned about liberals and the far left and progressives and the woke culture. I'm on board with you there. And they're like, okay, good. So we have a little common ground. then I'll say, and I used to own guns and I was against gun control, but I kind of changed my mind and here's why. Say we're talking about guns. And they're like, oh. So I've kind of pulled them along like, okay, he's with me. Oh, there's just one little thing.
Mhm.
Okay, I think I'll listen to him because he's with me on these other things, or he's being respectful, or he's paying attention, and he can see why I love my guns or something like that.
Right.
I learned that when I did it. I did a series of gun debates with John Lott, who is the guy that wrote that book, More Guns, Less Crime. He's sort of a regular on Fox News for a while after that book came out.
Yeah.
And, so we did a series of public debates. One of them was in Texas. And I swear, most of the audience, I think, was packing heat.
I'm sure. I can imagine.
So
how did the debate?
You got to be respectful.
Yeah. And how did the debate go?
I think they mostly supported him going
Mhm.
in.
Yeah.
Which is why I said, look, I grew up with guns. This is true. My stepfather was a hunter of shotguns, dove, quail, ducks, stuff like that. And I used to do that. And then I had a handgun for about 20 years, actually, in my home.
Mhm.
Then I eventually got rid of it. I was going, my marriage kind of turned sour and we were having some nasty fights. I thought, I'm just going to get rid of this thing. I don't want anybody doing anything crazy because this is what happens, right? People lose their minds in fights and they lose their temper. And if you have a weapon around, that's, probably half of all gun violence is accidents like that.
Yeah.
You call them accidents, but just spur of the moment, heat of the moment kind of thing. And then I've never had a gun since. I'm not saying I would never get one. And it's fine if that's what you think you want to do, get a gun. But just know that there's risks with that. Not just to mention the problems I just talked about, but somebody breaks into your home and they got your gun. Well, you may get shot with your own gun, or your kid's friends come over and they find the gun, and did you properly unload it? Is the ammunition somewhere else? Did you remember to go through the steps of, all the safety measures you take? And, there's a risk. It's not risk-free. Thomas Sowell always says there's no solutions. They're just trade-offs.
Yeah.
So it's always going to be risks.
Yeah. And so we want to obviously be mindful of your time. And before we wrap up, Mike, I also wanted to tell you, so something that was really important to me in my psychotherapy and my practice. So your article on cosmic insignificance was super significant for my work. So I kind of work as an existential therapist. Yeah. So just being able to separate what's, cosmic meaning and cosmic significance on that grand scale from the scale that we live on, kind of Alvy and going back to that Woody Allen film, Annie Hall. Yeah, that's been super important to me, especially with depressed patients, because in their minds, it's always like, well, I don't matter because who cares, right? The universe is going to go on without me. And I frequently kind of point to some of the ideas in your article. And I tell them, yeah, but we don't live on that scale. Your mother doesn't care whether or not you're going to affect the trajectory of the universe. I don't care whether you're not. You're going to affect the trajectory of the universe, right? So, but the point is that we care about you individually. So thank you for writing that.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for saying that. I didn't know that's what you do. So you have a clinical practice, and a lot of your clients have suffer from depression or sadness or anxiety or whatever. Okay.
Yeah. So depression, anxiety, a few personality disorders here and there. Yeah.
And I haven't followed this literature in a long time, but is cognitive behavioral therapy still pretty popular for dealing with a lot of these things?
Absolutely. So so I'm pretty much a cognitive behavioral therapist / existential therapist.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then how do you deal with somebody's? Yeah. Okay. So I guess you just tell them read Shermer's article. No.
Something like that. Yeah.
But how do you know? I'm just curious. How do you know if somebody that's clinically depressed or they're super sad or and they're describing it in a way you would say, well, they're existentially depressed or sad. But how do you know it's not just brain chemistry? They're just having
That's a great question. So it's actually both. So what's so interesting is that in kind of the mainstream public sort of understanding, there's sort of a way of separating mental illness from regular problems where we can say, well, this person doesn't have bipolar disorder, right? It just seems to be the situation. Or actually, that's not true. So it's always some level of brain chemistry involved. So can we say that somebody might be really excited? Yeah, of course, we get excited all the time. But when we're talking about bipolar disorder, we can't say somebody's having a manic episode, but no, it's not brain chemistry. It's just a situation. So to answer answer your question, it's actually both. So so what's so interesting about therapy is that sometimes therapy doesn't work, and what you actually find is that the medication is more effective. Where, like, let's say in the long run, what happens is if they're on, like, let's say a reasonable dose of it, and it's a medication that works for them, that makes them susceptible to therapy, which is the hope. So the hope is not necessarily for the medication to cure them; it's for them to be able to take in and actually really consider the ideas of therapy. Whereas for some other people, let's say if they take medication, it's honestly becomes, I don't want to say a shit show, but it gets really bad because of the side effects. So what happens for those kind of people is therapy is actually more effective, where they're like, you know what, I actually don't like medication and I seriously want to consider some of the ideas in therapy. But there's no actual way to separate it. It's sort of like saying, can we separate the mind or the body? We can't. It's all sort of interconnected and infused. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How interesting. How interesting. Yeah. So, and do they still recommend SSRIs for mild depression to serious depression?
So good question. So not for mild depression. So for mild depression, the idea is essentially you go into cognitive behavioral therapy off the bat. So for moderate depression, SSRIs are recommended because for, let's say, somebody who's struggling with moderate depression, the chances of them like actually benefiting from therapy are very low, just because they're kind of, they're susceptible to negative moods and negative biases. And then when you're kind of trying to talk things through, they kind of find a way to wiggle around your explanations. So they're like, well, you're just my therapist. Of course, you're going to say these things. Here are all the reasons why I suck, right? And for severe depression, it's definitely like probably the only thing that actually works, because for severe depression, therapy is actually often counterindicated because unfortunately it's often not effective at all. But for mild depression, therapy is like the first kind of recourse. They actually, if a psychiatrist recommends medication for you and you have mild depression, there's actually a problem with the psychiatrist.
Huh. Oh,
Yeah. He's usually like money hungry, because usually if you come in and you're like, hey, I've been kind of feeling sad for the past 2 weeks. I'm functioning okay. I'm getting through, my day to day okay. Work is still somewhat enjoyable. I'm still interacting with my family. Yeah, a psychiatrist doesn't say, you know what, we're going to put you on an SSRI. No, it's like, here, go see a therapist.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I presume you distinguish between sort of crisis moments of depression or anxiety because something happened, divorce or death in the family, lost your job, versus chronic over, I've always felt this way, or I've been sad for 10 years or something like that.
Yeah, so there's a highly sensitive personality trait, which is pretty much, research indicates that it's genetic at this point. So if that's the case, then those people kind of, it's sort of like, it's like a tumultuous sea. So they have like really high highs occasionally, but it's mostly low lows, where it's sort of like anything in life sort of beats them down. It's the antithesis of like stoicism in the way that we kind of think about it. Whereas like, you would have a person who's just, let's say, periodically depressed, or maybe has like recurrent episodes. So those people usually get it during like real crises, or like, crises for most of us, like divorce, let's say, death in the family, etc. Whereas honestly, most people don't even actually experience depressive episodes during like those periods. They get really sad, but they wouldn't necessarily meet the criteria for major depressive disorder.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
I had a girlfriend once who she had long-term severe depression, and she had to take the SSRIs. And she said, if I didn't do it, I just couldn't even get out of bed. I just didn't want to go to work. I mean, how do you know you got a problem? Well, if your spouse leaves you, you lose your job, or whatever, you got a problem, right? It's kind of the sort of operational definition of an addiction or a problem would be, if your life is totally fucked up, you got a problem.
And the good thing
not to make light of it, but but it was like with pornography. We did an issue on Skeptic on pornography. Is it dangerous or not? Well, I don't know if that's all you do, and you don't have a girlfriend or a wife, because it's mostly guys that do this, or your wife leaves you, or you lose your job because you're watching porn at work. You got a problem. But on the other hand, if you enjoy porn and your spouse loves porn and it makes for a great sex life, you don't have a problem, right? It's kind of, you sort of defined by how it affects somebody, which may be different for somebody else watching the same amount of porn. So hard, that idea of addiction it's very context dependent, it seems.
Yeah, and based on, I would even say, interpretation, like especially when it comes to depression, it really just depends on how the person is seeing the world, which is why like CBT is so important. Because sometimes, let's say if you're watching porn and I don't know, let's say your partner walks in and it's like, oh my God, you're cheating on me. You must think I'm ugly and like this person is gorgeous, right? Of course, you're going to get super depressed, or at least, it's going to sustain depression. Whereas if another person walks in and watches you watching porn and they're like, hey, I want to join you, right? You have a whole different outcome. So
that's right. Outcome, definitely. Yes. That's a good way to put it.
Absolutely.
All right, boys, on that, let's end Well, let's end on porn. That's a great
All right. That's so Alan,
What?
final question. Final question for Michael before we go.
If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, where could we find you?
Oh yeah, sure. So skeptic.com is the main page for the magazine, and then michaelshermer.com, and on Amazon, you type in my name, my books are all there. And the Michael Shermer Show, it's just you can find it at skeptic.com. That's who hosts it.
Yeah, and I want to just advise really quickly for everybody to check out the episode that Michael just did with Daniel Dennett and Greg Caruso on free will. Really awesome episode.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it was long.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
when philosophers get into the weeds with their thought experiments, my eyes kind of glaze over. I'm like, well, 15 minutes ago, I where are we now? I've lost the thread.
Yeah, and I really appreciated your work in clarifying. So that was really important for me in watching it.
Thank you.
All right, Michael. Thank you so
right,
so
guys.
much
Thank
for
you so
coming
much.
on.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah,
All
let
right,
me
so-
know when you post it, and we'll share it on social media.
Awesome. Thank you so
Better.
much. We'll
Take
talk to
care.
you soon.
All right.
Bye.
All right.
Ooh.
That was awesome.
That was epic.
Awesome.
That was epic.
All right, guys. If you want to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe,
Hit the bell.
And and thank you, of course, for watching. See you guys next time.